Thank you, Dr. Williams. At this time, we'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Burgess, Director of the Gerontology Institute and Professor of Gerontology and Sociology at Georgia State University. As I indicated earlier, she studies sexuality in older adults and older adults living with dementia.
How's everyone doing? Loud. If you need to stretch or stand, we've been all sitting. I know you're going to get an official break after the next speaker, but that's still a little ways away. So if you need to speak, if you need to stretch or stand or wiggle, I totally understand. So I'm coming at this from a different angle. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a medical researcher. And I have been thinking about sex for 30 years. I've been thinking about it really across the lifespan. So I wear multiple hats. I'm a social gerontologist. I'm a sexuality scholar. I'm a feminist researcher. And what I'm really interested in is where people are socially located, for instance, in assisted living facilities, and how that location influences their experience, like sexuality and relationships. And so I've done this in a variety of ways. I'm a co-editor of a textbook called Sex Matters that's now in its 5th edition that undergraduates across the country use when they learn about sexuality. I teach and do research in the Gerontology Institute. I'm increasingly working with the Culture Change Network of Georgia through a new project that's looking at nursing homes across the state and how they deliver person-centered care. So I do a variety of things. But what I've become increasingly interested in is how we think about sexuality in older adults. And more recently, looking at issues of how we think about sexuality with dementia and mild cognitive impairment as we move forward in life. I always like to give people a preview of where we're going. I like to start by talking about the stereotypes. Like Dr. Williams was saying, Hollywood gives us these images, but it's not just Hollywood, it's also our neighbors. It may be our pastor, it may be our doctor are giving us these stereotypes. So I'm going to talk about the stereotypes around sexuality and aging a little bit. Opportunity structure as a social gerontologist, I've got to talk about not just what your body's doing, but how the world around us structures those opportunities. And then a little bit about my research on sexuality and intimacy, and I was looking particularly in assisted living. And a little bit about the implications, and we'll see if I can stay within my time and get all that done. So, stereotypes about older adults. One of the biggest stereotypes is you hit a certain age and you're not interested in sex. I would bet everybody in this room says, no, that's not true. If I talk to my 20-year-old undergraduates and I ask them, when do you stop having an interest in sex? They'll say, I don't know, 40? And as I get older as an instructor, I get more and more offended by that answer. Older adults are not physically able to have sex, and so the thought is you have certain chronic diseases or you have a heart attack, you can no longer have sex. Absolutely not true. Let's stop for a minute and talk about what do I mean by sex. When I'm talking about sex, I'm not just talking about vaginal penile intercourse. That's what kind of the Hollywood version of sex is, right? But sex is about sexuality. It includes the touching that Dr. Williams was talking about. It includes a variety of sensual activity, and we really limit our opportunity if we're just thinking about coitus or vaginal sex. So when we think about not having sex, we're thinking about men can no longer get erections, women are too weak. The idea is often that older adults that have an interest of sex are deviant in some way. How many people have heard of the stereotype of dirty old men, right? Sometimes the dirty old woman, we laugh if a woman is interested in sex, she's got something wrong with her, right? Another thing, and we'll be talking about this with our next speaker, is older adults don't have to worry about disease. This is absolutely not true. Often when we think we're done with the procreative years, that we no longer have to think about what some of the problems are with sex. There is no time limit to sexual transmitted disease and infections. And you'll be hearing, I'm sure, some really good information about that next. All older adults are heterosexual. While the predominant sexual identity among older adults is heterosexual, you can be bisexual, you can be gay or lesbian or polyamorous late in life. And so when we make those assumptions, we're increasingly putting gay and lesbians in the closet in late life. And so we see more and more instances of gay and lesbian older adults who need care denying their sexual orientation because they're afraid their healthcare provider will discriminate against them, that they won't be able to get in the long-term care facility because they won't serve them because they're gay or lesbian. And I think the one that's we're thinking about most here is the stereotype that older adults with cognitive impairment or dementia should not be sexually active. That once you get a diagnosis of dementia, that it's over. No more intimacy for you. It's no longer safe. It's no longer important to your life. You need to be focusing on other things. And that is absolutely untrue. Just like we heard from Dr. Lau, there's a variety of cars of dementia that Dr. Parker talked about, but it's also a continuum. And most of the time after you have a diagnosis is not that last later stage of dementia where you need full-time support. You may still be working, you may still be married, you may still have other opportunities. We need to think about dementia as just being part of your life, and sexuality remains part of your life. So we often think that older adults with dementia can't control themselves sexually. So one of the things when we do hear news about older adults and sexuality, when we hear it in the news, often it's these stories of older adults who have forgotten their spouses and have taken up with somebody else. That's the story that we frequently hear about older adults with dementia. And we don't hear about the older adults that are still maintaining loving relationships with their long-term spouses. But that's the more likely story. Or that they'll be victimized. I think the other story is, oh, that poor old woman with dementia, she has been mistreated or abused. Of course, there are cases where people have been abused, but the majority of times, that's not the whole story for everyone. So what is the story when we talk about sexuality and well-being? And the majority of older adults, just like I got a laugh in here from all of you, are interested. We do have desire for sexuality across the life course. And most people are able to, because if we don't think about sexuality as just being one thing, we think of it as a continuum, or I like to even say a constellation. So it's not just a unidirectional, but it's a variety of things that we can play with in our lives. You can engage in a wide variety of ways. Chronological age alone does not lead to a decrease in sexual behavior. There's a variety of things. Lack of a partner is the #1 reason that people are not sexually active later in life, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. If you don't have a partner, then all you have is yourself. And while you can please yourself individually, and despite a stereotype that older adults don't masturbate, I can guarantee you that they can, and they do. Health and cognitive decline, both of yourself and your partner, can slow down or change your sexual interest, your desire, or what you're able to do. It doesn't mean that it has to stop what you're doing. And one of the things that I'm most passionate in dispelling is ageist beliefs about ourselves and our loved ones that really influence what the opportunities people have. We live in a society that, as many of you know, is still shaped by ageist attitudes of what you can and cannot do after a certain age, with a chronic health diagnosis, with a dementia diagnosis. And we need to move beyond that as a society. This is really, we're beginning to talk about this as a public health problem. Ageism is a public health problem because it's impacting the ability of older adults to live healthy and live well. And we need to move past that when it comes to sexuality as well. And there's an increasing amount of research that shows that being sexually active or sexually intimate can lead to health, overall health and well-being. It's psychologically beneficial. It's a kind of social engagement. But there also are physiological elements to it that can be better for you than not engaging in this way. So when I talk about opportunity structure, I'm going to talk about something we talked about in the very beginning of the day, 3/4 women in this room. When you look at the number of women there are per men, the older you get, the fewer there are. So at the age of 65 plus, right now, the green line is what is predicted for 2030. The blue line is 2014. So right now, over 65, there's 78 men for every 100 women. This changes as you get, the number, it changes as you get older. So if you look 65 to 85, 84, you see it's 84 to 100. You go 85 and plus, and you're talking 52 men to every 100 women. That's a big disparity, and if you're a heterosexual older adult looking for a partner, there's not a lot of partners out there. You add to this the fact that older adults, among older men, they're more likely to remarry quicker than older women, and so the men that are older are more likely to be married. And who do they marry? Do they marry somebody who is their age or older? No. They're marrying somebody in that younger age group. And so they're looking outside of the age group stereotypically. And so that makes this disparity even greater when we look at potential partners. But opportunity structure is also about other things. So part of it's just the sexual marketplace in terms of who's available. But it's also about these issues of race, ethnicity, religion, culture. Often we want to partner with people who are similar to us in background. Are those people available to us? Are there people like us that we want to partner with? So just because there is an older man out there, he may not be somebody you're interested in. We have to recognize that these other factors play a role. Sexual identity plays a role. Widowhood and divorce plays a role. There's increasingly a stereotype that widowed women don't want to marry divorced men because they have different expectations. So these types of things, these social factors, influence what we do with our own body and how we interact with other people. Another thing, and I think many of you here are caregivers. Where are my caregivers in the room? Caregiver fatigue influences how we think about ourselves and how we think about our partners. And so no matter how sexual you want to be, if you're up all night helping your loved one, you're not feeling sexy. If you are helping them with activities of daily living, you're not feeling as sexy about them, about what's going on. So the health of self and partner and the psychological stress of caregiving gets in the way, but we don't talk about that. Often we think about it in ways that are very limited. I've done some interviews where I've interviewed people living with dementia who are on the earlier or mild stages of dementia, and they said, my partner, once I got that diagnosis, zip, nothing. Suddenly was not interested in me sexually because suddenly she viewed me as a patient and not a lover. We need to think about these issues ethically. We need to think about where do we find a way to balance those responsibilities. Maybe it's through respite care. Maybe it's through talking about these issues. Communication is a big part of these issues, and one of the benefits of early diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's disease is you have an opportunity to have these discussions before you get to those late stages where the caregiving is really resulting in caregiver fatigue. So you can find out what your partner wants, what your partner's needs are, and you can think about what's comfortable and what's not comfortable. And then social location is another part of it. Are you community dwelling? Do you live in your private home, or do you live in a retirement community? Do you live in some kind of long-term care facility, assisted living, nursing homes? Most of my research that I've done previously is in assisted living. I'm increasingly looking at nursing homes now, but I think it's important, obviously, to look across the continuum. I bet most of you are community dwelling. That brings a whole different set of issues, as you may be living in the community, in your house, in the suburbs, where nobody knows what's happening. You don't have an opportunity to meet other people. You're not comfortable around other people, and how that impacts what your opportunities are. So I did a research study that looked at the issues of negotiating sexuality in assisted living, and I was looking at it from a qualitative perspective. So I was talking to people, I was doing focus groups, I was spending time hanging out with people, engaging in their activities of daily living, and I was really looking at how we thought about these issues in this communal setting of assisted living. And I wanted to look not just about how older adults themselves felt, but also about how the people working with older adults were thinking about these issues. So the staff, the family members, the administrators, and what those issues are. I've published a couple of articles off of this research. If you want access to any of these articles, because I know that these kind of ivory tower articles aren't available to most people, I'm happy to get you copies of that. And the thing that I'm currently working on now is looking at the issue of sexuality and dementia. So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about that. Despite what you might have heard, assisted living is not a hop-in sexual marketplace. Every now and then, there is some story about a retirement community or an assisted living facility that talks about it as being this wild and crazy place. I think there was even a television show that talked about the swinging singles in the retirement community. While that may be a case once in a while, it's really not what's going on. Most people that are in long-term care are there because they need care, and so it's not so much about what they're looking actively for, but what they hope for, what their desire is for, and how things like touch and hand-holding and time together in terms of building relationships that sometimes lead to something else can move forward. So the things that, the kind of core themes that I found with my colleagues on this is that there is a tension. There's a tension when you're in long-term care and we're thinking about relationships. There's a tension between oversight and sexual freedom. So if you're in a long-term care facility, they're trying to take care of a lot of people. They may have 25 people, they may have 125 people that they're taking care of, and their job is to provide a safe and healthy environment for everybody. And they have rules and regulations laid out by the state that they have to adhere to. So while you have the right to do your own thing, they also have the right to try to protect everybody. And finding that balance between sexual freedom of individual residents and the care and well-being of everybody is an issue. For the people who work in assisted living, it's a workplace. Yet the people who live there, it's their home. And so the balancing between the behavior that you're engaging in with the workplace that you're engaging in. And so when I talked to staff, some of them were very happy to see loving older adults engaging sexually. Others were kind of offended by it a little bit. And so I think one of the things that one of my study staff members said was, well, I don't want to have to clean up sheets when Grandpa masturbated. Well, why not? How is that any different from cleaning up sheets from any other issue? But we have these stereotypes about older adults. And how about we talk with them about what would be the most comfortable way to provide that resource? So that's a tension. And then there's the tension between residents' desires, what they want, oh my goodness, 3 minutes, and what they can do. And so we also have lack of training. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, and I'm happy to do more in the Q&A if we need. So negotiating the lack of intimacy in assisted living, what we really found is it wasn't about the swinging singles. It was about how you dealt with the absence of intimacy. And this is what happens for a lot of older adults in that fourth quarter, to steal Dr. Williams' term. Because of the lack of opportunity, it's the absence that gets in the way more than the presence or the opportunities. And how do you deal with that? And how do you communicate with that? And how do you deal with that both within yourself? How do you manage and negotiate these barriers, and what the strategies are that we use to deal with that? And so this is a kind of a social psychological model for thinking about how we negotiate the lack of intimacy. If you look at this slide, the dark green spaces are the only private spaces. This is a typical assisted living facility, a floor of an assisted living facility. Each one of these is a room, and the dark spaces are rooms that have a door that can be closed. If you live in a long-term care facility, privacy is at a minimum. If you know that somebody can walk in on you at any time, how comfortable are you in engaging with sexuality? So I'm not going to go over these strategies, so I can talk about dementia a little bit. When we originally did this study, and this tells how much things have changed because of the work of places like the Emory Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. When we first did this study, we were told, and this is an NIH-funded study, not to talk to people living with dementia about sexuality, that was risky. And so we didn't actively do it, but we talked to people about people living with dementia. And we found a real reliance on stereotypes. Staff and other residents and family members relied on stereotypes, and they weren't the same stereotypes. So in the same facility, we'd have one staff member saying, older adults with dementia all act out sexually in inappropriate ways. And then another one would say, well, older adults with dementia can't do anything. And then somebody else would say, we need to protect that little old lady because she has dementia and the old men are going to come and get her. So we had this really cautious approach that led to very protectionist attitudes about residents with dementia and gendered assumptions. And I'm going to just slip to my last slide so that we can end here. So my big belief is when we think about sexuality and aging, and particularly when we think about older adults, that we need to challenge our stereotypes. And we need to acknowledge that desire for intimacy is normal and healthy across the lifespan. We have to recognize that we all have those desires. And we need to provide opportunity for ongoing sex education for adults of all ages, including issues of dementia. This is one of my #1 thoughts. Sex education shouldn't just be for 9th graders or 12th graders, because our bodies change, just like we heard from our last speaker. We need to be continually thinking about this, not just from our gynecologists, because that's only getting at part of the issue, but in a variety of ways. We need training for healthcare professionals, long-term care staff, and administrators about issues of sexuality so that they know. I would also say for pastors, for community leaders, for everyone. And we need to have person-centered approaches to care to realize that one person with dementia is not 100 people with dementia. If you've met one person, you've met one person. So acknowledgement, all those good people, and thank you. Sorry to rush through a little bit. I got excited talking to you all.